Thank you for the introduction. It's really nice to be here back in Maribor. I think the first time that I came was about 10 years ago, and it's always a pleasure to be back and be with people here. So, Jiva has said a little bit about my work, but just to run through a few things so you can kind of get a good idea, a sense of my practice. As Jiva said, I work with new media technologies, and really if I think about my practice as an artist, everything really from 2000 onwards is using some kind of computational system, networks, code in the production of the work. And with that in mind, of course, these pieces sometimes exist on the screen, sort of being made in algorithmic systems like, say, Flash or Shockwave or, various forms of HTML, and it could be sort of like a two-dimensional construct or even sort of three-dimensional. So we think about sort of early virtual worlds work online on the internet using things like VRML, virtual reality modeling language. That goes back some kind of years, and combining that with server-side processes, sort of Java and other kind of live data applications. And also, say, shared virtual environments, so emerging sort of platforms that have kind of come from a more gamer system technology, so things like Second Life, Open Simulator, in the production of the work. And yes, these things can be experienced just through, say, a computer or through a screen. They can even be showed online through sort of net art portals. I did a lot of sort of exhibitions, if you will, through organizations like turbulence.org or Rhizome, further afield in the UK. But really through all my practice, I've wanted to kind of get things off the screen, and into real space, and also use the kind of the power of one of the benefits of working with new media, that is to say, the idea of an iterative process. So we can take a single entity, like their single channel, broadcast quality digital video, kind of before that was the real standard, that becomes in a multi-channel installation, and then this is actually a picture of London's first ever video wall, digital video wall in Leicester Square, which I was allowed to use, approach to use for a series of artwork. So you can see there how the same work sort of transposes and sort of changes across a variety of media. So for all the frustrations with working with things that are digital, there are actually some benefits, this idea of iterating into new emerging spaces. And then other sort of working in bringing things off the screen into a physical, experiential sort of setting. So whether in sort of a black box environment, which one can create to produce interesting experiences, with data and computational systems, or sort of these hybrid performance spaces. So this was a virtual worlds project that was actually realized as a virtual physical performance in Hellerau, which is outside of Dresden, so sort of the birthplace of modernism in the theater, where, a century ago, sort of really kind of leading experiments were done. So again, we kind of use that setting to think about what is possible now in the digital age. In working into architectures, a lot of what I do sort of, and I'll talk about later, kind of tracks back through history, because the things that we use today in terms of sort of leading edge technologies are often based on things from our past. They don't exist in this sort of isolated, 21st century only mindset. They actually have a lineage. So actually going back and using architectural spaces and using those old analog historical spaces and putting things that are unapologetically digital into them, sometimes can actually be a very nice contrast and juxtaposition. So I often try to do that in my work, as you can see here. And then finally, of course, as a visual artist, one sort of primary home is, of course, the kind of white cube context, if you will. So the sacrosanct space for art of the blank canvas, where we can go in and produce things. And Jiva mentioned that I was one of the artists to represent the UK at Manifesta, in 2010. And here's the exhibition. But it was more than that. It was a year-long research project. And also to say that even though that the final result is something that, if you had a quick glance, it's like, oh, this is a contemporary visual art exhibition. But if you take away the computers, if you take away the digital process, the methodology, all that kind of research that happens through the digital space, you basically have a gallery of nothing. So it's this idea for my practice is I work very much in the tradition of visual art, but with the added layer of technology. And what can technology bring? And for a final sort of just slide, this is from images from a show that I did called Living Data, a solo exhibition that toured around the UK. And again, this notion of, quite literally using the technological infrastructure, in this case, to look at big data sources and bring those in to things that were like sculpture, installation, painting, in ways that not only is everything, of course, changing in real time, but also, as you can see here, the live data, the digital material itself becomes part of the artwork. Because in terms of what I'm always trying to do, it's really sort of looking at, the effects of technology, on, the wider digital culture. And what does that mean for us here and now? And I think, and especially over the last 20 years, it's become more important where, artists like myself are really using the platform of arts as a way to sort of dialogue and critique with the public about sort of issues of this time, So I thought today, in terms of talking about my work in virtual worlds, which I've been asked to do tonight, I thought I would really focus on this sort of relationship between technology and culture and society, and what that means, in particular, virtual technologies, okay? So I'm a firm believer of always sort of, as an artist, I only ever sort of talk about and produce work that I'm very sort of comfortable and knowledgeable about in terms of the underlying sort of digital cultural aspects, So these are some things from my early days. I mean, I'm a first generation digital native, and so far as that, I grew up with the first sort of computer systems. I used to be, really into video gaming. My first console was Pong, things like that. And when I was at university, of course, it's when things like Doom came out, first person, the first sort of iterations of real-time virtual environments in a games sort of context. And also, my training is in science and technology. So sort of having access and sort of working with really high-end visualization systems for science and sort of being exposed to things like this is a picture of an early cave that was developed in, University of Chicago sort of years ago. But that's kind of the setting from a sort of a cultural, educational standpoint that I come from. And even today, I still practice what I preach. So, this is an image of one of my avatars in the multi-game environment, Destiny, which I'm an avid gamer, still am. Have less time because I'm, have to actually do proper job and work and things like that. But in my spare time, I still play a lot of games and sort of exist online. And again, I think that's an important thing because if you're going to reflect about, or critique a sort of a new sort of social space in the digital world, you should actually understand it. You should be part of it. And that is something that I certainly have always done through my life. And if we look at sort of the software, the virtual environment side of thing, again, back to the early things that I showed you from the range of things from my practice, we also have to think about what devices can we use to get that off the screen and get them into some kind of experiential space. So I think the last 10 years has actually been quite exciting because the development of technologies, whether it be sort of like mobile planetariums, domes, or VR headsets, are now sort of affordable for artists like myself and, Mark, who will be speaking next, to actually use in the practice. I mean, these kinds of systems I've actually used way back in the sort of the development, days, you know, I have a headset at home that is actually one of the first LCD headsets, but it's this massive thing, you know. And even though I sort of made little prototypes for it, I never wanted to use it in the production of an actual work because it was just unwieldy. You know, the technology, in my opinion, wasn't well developed enough to actually do what I wanted to do creatively. But now we're kind of past that stage, which is great, in an exciting time. So, you know, in thinking about that, thinking about 3D and VR technologies, and sort of how, you know, over the last 10 years, I'm thinking, okay, how can I actually integrate more and more sort of possibilities that they offer into my artworks and experiences? But while I've been doing that, one of the things that I always keep in mind is that these are not new traditions. So if we think about, say, virtual reality and this idea of the expansion of the mind into some other world, you know, this is not a new concept. So if we think about things like illusion and immersion, you know, these are notions that sort of track back through our history. You know, we can look at sort of Roman fresco wall painting. This is a villa that I've actually visited, the Villa of Aplantis at Bosco Real. And, you know, again, it's a painted, scenographic, performative, communal space, you know, multi-sensory space. So using the technology of their time, again, the Romans produced what you could argue, and other scholars like have certainly argued, I think successfully, that this is VR for that time period. Or even tracing back to our earliest forms of sort of architectural art, the cave paintings at Lascaux. Again, people have made I think, very convincing arguments that this is also sort of VR. So we can think about the traditions of work that I produce, but within this historical context. So starting with that, you know, I mean, I think it's important to think about this idea of the virtual being paired with the psychological in the creation of realities, and also the physical also being linked to this notion of the communal. You know, because often, you know, these are sort of parts of the same equation in terms of, you know, why an artist like myself is interested in exploring this kind of work. So let's start. I'm going to show a few examples of projects kind of related to various themes. And the first I want to start with is this notion of the shared environment. And with that in mind, I sort of have already talked about how one of the areas that I work in is things like Second Life and Open Simulator. Not because they're visually that interesting, they're very actually technologically inferior to games engines, but the fact that they're real time in a shared virtual space where you can co-create together, that's actually something that's quite unique. And this project, one of the projects that I actually worked and produced in Open Simulator was called Visions of Our Communal Dreams. And this was a commission for the Robots and Avatars project, the main Virtual Worlds commission in 2012. And the idea of the piece was actually, what if I made this kind of utopia Eden environment of a blank sort of island, canvas landscape, for people then to come in and to create with me and to build that up over time. You know, the project initially launched at FACT in Liverpool in its first iteration, where I worked with a group of media arts students, they're young girls, to kind of add things, and we sort of co-created various elements for this landscape. And then brought them in and sort of created these virtual physical portals to kind of connect various physical spaces in fact to this virtual environment in real time. So I've got just a quick sort of video that FACT had put together. Idea of this project is to build these sort of mixed reality portals. So we're going to be building this virtual forest together, right? In the virtual world we would work in. But what we want to do is bring that in to the physical reality, in fact. We call it mixed reality, so it's blending the virtual and the physical together into sort of one reality, okay? Where people from the virtual can see into the physical, and people in the physical can see into the virtual. For projects like Visions of Our Communal Dreams, the reason why I like to work collaboratively is that with avatars in virtual worlds, it really opens up the creative possibilities. Once you start, it's not just myself as the artist, but it's a range of possibilities, a range of opinions coming in sort of together, coalescing into a work. And that's what's really nice. Now what we're going to do today is I'll let you have about 5 minutes to fiddle with your avatars and fly around and such, but then we're going to quickly jump into building. Okay, on activity 1, what I need to do is show you all how to do all the basics of building.
We've basically learned how to make our own little walls, and we started making the shape for our wall by making little cubes and all that and joining them together.
The head, and then key in a number. So key in sort of like take it up to 20 in the position 25.5, for example. Just make it precise, just say 25.5, so you know you've gone up a full meter, right? Get your piece, and then when you drop it back down, you know you just drop it back to 24.5.
Okay.
The Visions of Our Communal Dreams piece will be one of the main, if not the biggest project in the upcoming Robots and Avatars show, okay? And I've secured different sort of spaces for us to use, okay? So let's just go through those and I'll show you. Now this space is going to be the space where I'd like us to actually show our process for what it is, okay? Because this is going to be the first sort of space that when people come to the Robots and Avatars show, they're going to see right there, okay? So the front doors are sort of right here, there. So this is something that I'm going to produce, you know, on my own, but says, okay, this provides the context for everything we do together. This is our sort of traditional landscape.
I think that it's really good because we've added a hill now, so it's not all on one level. So we can walk up hills and walk down hills. And we've also added like a stream and a sea. And we can even swim in it.
Right. Because what matters is what it looks like, okay?
Today we've been doing mushrooms, and we've been doing the textures and changing them and making our avatars sing and
We've made mushrooms that we can sit on. It's really something different to the island because we haven't made something yet that you can actually interact with. We've just made a pole that signifies where our mushroom is. Different people have been taking different jobs. So some people have been making the body parts and the others like clothes, and I did the eyes.
I'm looking forward to the project because I think we learn a lot of new things. Like we learn how like because a lot of our favourite games are like The Sims and things.
Club Penguin.
Yeah, Club Penguin. And I think it's nice to know what goes on behind the scenes. Behind the scenes.
So this is the conceptual beginnings of the piece. So this is my concept-based sort of very painterly thing here, which was the first time I resed the sim, the first sun, the first sunrise, the first tree. We can see into the virtual world through the dolls here in the physical space. But you see the texture there between the two trees. Okay, the real time. So in the virtual world, the avatars can see what's going on in the physical space. And you notice the camera up there. but other than that, just enjoy the night, because it's your night as well. So I hope with that maybe gave you a good sense of the project, and also the investment that my collaborators had. So there with a group of sort of a dozen young sort of digital media students from a local college that I worked with to actually create the first iteration of that virtual environment. And yes, I was the artist, the lead artist. It was my concept, but then it's this idea of sort of shared ownership, you know. And at the opening, it was actually them that actually took sort of the adults, the older people that didn't have a clue about the technologies or what was possible, and they all had their laptops, and they were sort of taking people through the world and sort of showing them, you know, what is possible. And that world evolved over time. So by the time the piece gets to the 2.0 stage, which you can see a screenshot here of like this very, you know, more resolved, beautiful virtual environment, you know, this was actually done at this point through with collaborations with, again, sort of students, art students and practitioners here at KIBLA. So this is the space right behind us where this project came to be. Again, sort of building these virtual physical portals and connecting that. And, you know, with virtual worlds and projects like these, you know, I think really one of the things that I'm looking to explore is this possibility of creation. And if we're thinking about this notion of the virtual being also things, you know, spaces we can dream and we can create within, you know, with the technologies we have access to today, we can actually do that quite literally. We can do that together, you know, in an environment just like, say, a physical environment where we gather and co-create as a group. We can do that in the virtual platform. So that's the first thing. The second thing I'd like to talk about is this notion of visualizing data. So data, of course, is something that is very much a part of our lives these days. And in a while back, for the International Year of Astronomy, I was asked by think tank Birmingham Science Museum. They commissioned me to do a piece. They wanted me to look at sort of, okay, what is the relationship between data and astronomy? And I started thinking about that, and I was like, okay, that's a pretty far off topic. But one of the things that actually I came to was this notion of the radiosphere. So what happened was in the early 40s, when our transmissions, our media transmissions became powerful enough to sort of break into space, so those early sort of radio and television transmissions that, you know, the broadcast power had reached a certain level from a technological standpoint, and that they were able to escape into deep space. And then all of a sudden, once a wave is in deep space, it will travel from its point of origin for 1 light year per year to infinity. So I started thinking about, well, you know, there's actually this notion of data and broadcast and media being our history or reflective of our history, you know, this idea of our history sort of floating through space-time, you know, in this ever-increasing sort of sphere of influence of the universe that we've actually touched. So then I started to think about that more, and I said, okay, I found an astrophysicist, Dr. Joanna Jarvis. I said, will you work with me on this project? I'd really like to chart every star system that has ever heard our media signals. So she thought it was a great idea, and I assembled a team, and we did just that. And we released the first iteration of the piece as this virtual sculpture that tracked all those star systems. We did a version for the planetarium at Think Tank, and also something in exhibit in their sort of futures gallery. And then the curators for the Digital Design Weekend, Irene Papamitriou, sort of approached me and said she really liked the project, and could I actually find a way to realize it as one of the main features at the V&A does a Digital Design Weekend every year. And so we were able to find a way to do that using a mobile planetarium. So here's a little video to show how that. My name's Takeo Magruder. I'm the artist that's leading the Data project. This work is about the relationship between broadcast media and astronomy. And the idea for the piece really centers around the notion that when science began, we of course had a very Earth-centric, a human-centric view of our place within the stars. And over time, we realized that that was not correct, of course, that we're just a small speck in a wide, vast universe. But then, of course, art is often about bringing things back to humanity. And on that idea, what I wanted to do is I was looking through science, and in astronomy, there is still one example where we are the center of the universe, and that's with the concept of the radiosphere. So in 1941, our transmissions, our media transmissions, were strong enough to escape into deep space. From that point on, those transmissions would travel at 1 light year per year into space, traveling throughout to infinity to reach other star systems. So this artwork tracks all of the star systems in the 73 years since that point in time that our media signals have actually traveled to. So it creates this real-time virtual sculpture that people can navigate through. You can experience in different ways on a screen or in a large mobile planetarium dome like what you see behind you. And actually, it's a merging of the art, science, visualization, and technology, sort of all coming together to make this particular experience for people here at the V&A today.
My name is Dr. Joanna Jarvis. I'm a professional astrophysicist. My involvement with the Data project has been very much maintaining the scientific accuracy of the work. Obviously, over the last decades, we've collected an awful lot of information about the universe around us, the positionings of objects, what objects are, how bright they are in our night sky, and indeed, perhaps most interestingly, the existence of exoplanets, so planets in orbit around other stars local to the Earth. So all of those are actually portrayed within this piece of artwork, thinking about the communications from the Earth that those stars, those exoplanets, and therefore potentially other civilizations, other life forms are going to be receiving from the Earth. We can actually move our way out through this piece of artwork, stepping out slowly. At this point, we come right the way out to the edge of what we refer to as the radiosphere. So since we started broadcasting from the Earth, this is basically the outer limit of where all that data has gotten to, where that information has come. And then just to give us the biggest picture of possible, right out here at 150 light years, we're way beyond Earth's radiosphere at the moment. We haven't had any influence over this area of space yet. It will happen because there's nothing to stop our communications from just continuing infinitely through space.
So my role in this project is to mediate between the artist, the scientist, and the eventual realization of that in the dome. So what I've done is I've taken all of those different stakeholders and started to build up the different forms that we need. So as we've been talking about the different components, my job is to encode all of this, both graphically and within the actual code sections to make it realizable.
And over that weekend, we were able to actually get about 2,000 people through the dome. Emma was there. It was pretty crazy. But one of the nice things is that some people came and they sort of came because they were interested in the science. Some people came because they were interested in the art or the technology. But it really kind of spoke to pretty much every demographic we had there at the museum. And also, what was nice is that if someone was coming there wanting to actually see the technology, they then often became interested in the artistic concepts, and vice versa. Because again, if we're working in these spaces, sort of, if we think about sort of art, concept and technology, that really these works sort of bring all those sort of discussions together, and I think have a really good possibility of opening up people to things that that they don't know about, and it's bringing in and sort of like making these new experiences and these things that again only today are really kind of possible through these kind of technologies. Now, thinking back through history, you know, this idea of reimagining history, this is the next thing that I want to just briefly speak on. You know, and for this sort of case study, like I said, you know, in my opening, that, you know, if we're thinking about kind of technological process, this is not necessarily a 21st century thing. You know, we can actually track back through histories of technology. And when people often ask me what I think about sort of this current, you know, information revolution that we're now presently in, one of the things I always talk about is, of course, the first information revolution, or one of them, you know, which is the invention of the printing press. And we think about that in relation to other kind of social, political things that were happening at the time, the fact that that was actually highly related to religion and the printing of, you know, sort of religious doctrine. And I thought, so, that's an interesting segue there. And a number of years ago, like Jiva said, I was honored to be a Leverhulme Trust Artist in Residence with the theology department at King's College in London, which it's actually one of the most famous theology departments in Europe, you know, certainly the biggest in Britain. And working with Professor Ben Quash, we sort of kind of came up with this idea of looking at notions of the apocalypse as seen through that seminal text, the book of Revelation, but, you know, trying to update and sort of extend that to, well, what is that for a digital age, an information age, a virtual age? So we did the residency, where I spent time with Ben and his colleagues, and at the end of it, the byproducts were, you know, so interesting to Ben that he took them to colleagues of his at Somerset House, and they decided to put on a really cool solo exhibition. So that was 5 major installations, which each one was basically myself in dialogue with a particular academic who is specialized in the book of Revelation and sort of discussing various things. So I'll show a quick video of that, and then end with the virtual reality piece that was actually in that show. My name is Michael Takeo Magruder. I'm a visual artist and researcher working with many digital technologies, everything from mobile devices, code, virtual worlds, live data.
My name is Alfredo Cramerotti. I'm a curator. In this occasion, I'm actually working to support Michael's work. This exhibition specifically, it has an interesting mix between very traditional, established, important art forms and sort of a reconstituted and represented with cutting-edge technology.
I wrote a foreword for the show, which talks of my thoughts when I was 8 years old, growing up in DC. And it was, of course, during the height of the Cold War, where revelation and sort of the end of times was, of course, a common theme, because there were points in that early childhood where we were very close to nuclear war. And I read Revelations for the first time, and I wondered if John the Seer was talking of locust hordes and falling stars, because he couldn't describe Apache helicopters and missiles falling from the sky. And when I sort of came to the idea for this sort of, I started to sort of wonder, well, my daughter, what does she fear? What does she hope? So that's really what I wanted to do with this exhibition, so to take this really seminal text and ask people, okay, in this day, in this time, you know, what are your locusts? What are your falling stars? The Horse's Technology installation is the one that I created of my own desire. The other 4 installations are based on my reactions to and discussions with the research of 4 theologians based at King's College in London. So the main focus of the installation is an actual physical horse skull. Everything else in the room is based off a digitization of that. Once it is in the digital space, then it can be transformed it can be replicated. You have the light boxes of the zeros and ones, the kind of the digital DNA, if you will. You have the 3D wireframes sort of emerging out of blackness. And then you have the physical manifestation, so the 3D printed objects, which are actually being created there in real time in the gallery.
It is about questions. It is about actually what we're doing here, where we come from, which is obviously something that art has always done, since cave paintings to coding.
Apocalypse, even though yes, we see it as destruction, the original context of the word is actually unveiling. And certainly as an artist, that's what I've tried to do. Now, of course, most of the installations dealt with the sort of the normal topics of Revelation, which is sort of, death, destruction, sort of the ending of things. But staying, I always like to be truthful to the data of a subject, whether that happens to be scientific data or in this case a biblical text that has undoubtedly sort of had so much influence on the Western sort of Christian world. So with that in mind, of course, the text ends with the description of sort of the new heavenly city, the new Jerusalem. But it's something that once you get into, it's actually very difficult to think, well, how would I actually make a work that represents this? Because, when you start looking at what the text actually says about, the prophesied city, it ends up being sort of this structure that is not something that could exist in the physical world as we know it. It is 10,000 stadia, wide as it is long as it is high, which means that's about a Borg cube the size of Texas. The city is made of gold, but that is translucent as glass. The lights in the city, the city, the sun does not exist anymore. The light comes from the city itself with the reflections of precious jewels and stones and things like that. And that there are, 12 gates, one for each tribe of Israel. The tree of life sits at the center. And so I started to think, well, how could one actually realize this in a way that is true to the text, that actually shows the possibilities of the information age, because that was kind of the two things that were coming together in this exhibition and project. So I thought, okay, well, what if I actually took sort of the text itself that was describing the city in Revelations, that sort of factual data, if you will, and translated that one for one into data code, and then took that data code and extruded it into 3 dimensions according to the sort of the simple math and geometric principles that are outlined there in the book of Revelation, there in chapter 22. And then put that in an environment, into Unity 3D, so that one could, using VR technologies, experience it in multiple viewpoints. Because again, like in the text, the narrator of Revelation, John the Seer, talks about sort of, in one moment, seeing the city descend, as you can see there on the projection screen, like a bride adorned for her groom. And then the next moment he's there in the center of the city, sort of looking out in this sort of endless expanse, there at the tree, by the tree of life. So it's that odd sort of thing, but say with a virtual environment, one can actually develop an experience that has these multiple simultaneous viewpoints. I could actually show the one viewpoint there in real time, of the city descending, while someone would don the headset and be there in John's sort of second position of sort of looking out of the city. And again, in a virtual environment, making streets of gold that are as translucent as glass, that's quite easy to do, So again, it's sort of looking at the technology as a way to not really just develop a piece that sort of showcases, oh, look at this cool new technology, but thinking about the technology as this new kind of creative possibility that allows sort of certain ideas to be realized in a way that is more appropriate, more true to concept, And then just to end up on a sort of final point, looking at this notion of digital collections. Jiva mentioned that I'm an artist and researcher in residence at both British Library and at the National Archives, and it's a real big honor. And really for the last kind of 10, 15 years, I've done a lot of work looking at this sort of the emergence of digital collections and this idea of communal sort of history, if you will, and cultural material that is now increasingly existing online. So a number of years ago, I was invited by British Library through their British Library Labs project to come in and to use their digital collections. I was really given kind of open rein to do whatever I wanted. And I honed in onto one particular collection, the 1 million images from Scan's book collection, which is a collection of sort of Victorian era books that had been sort of scanned. All the images, AI and machine learning algorithms have been used to extract all those images from the sort of 100,000 books, compile an archive with limited metadata, which then sort of was released onto Flickr Commons. And for me, it's everything that a digital sort of online collection should be. It's open source, open culture, anyone can use it, it's inherently remixable, but also every item comes with, so you have a collection item, but you also have metadata. So where people and machines alike can tag, can add favorites, it becomes something more than just sort of a finite object that is sitting somewhere in a museum or a library. And for that, I sort of started to think, well, why don't we look at this idea of cities and taking old kind of collection items, these old maps, and sort of bringing them back from obscurity and taking that old sort of item, creating some kind of new, unapologetically digital, fantastical sort of city from those roots, thinking along the lines of Italo Calvino's sort of his, invisible cities, kind of conceptual ideas that he was playing with in his prose. But add the layer of tapping into the liveness of the digital collection, actually using people's sort of interfacing and changing of that collection in real time to create things that were sort of part of my design, but also were getting affected by sort of how this collection is being used in real time. So that's where the Imaginary Cities project was born, which ended up being sort of a 3-4 year project where I had a year and a half residency, and then the results were, the library was just so excited about the results of the residency that they invited me to do a major solo show there, which just finished up at the end of the summer this past year. And here's how that kind of materialized. So various kind of virtual physical experiences, including, again, another headset piece, which I will talk about in just a second, but here's a little documentation video the library put together just to give you a good sense of how the show kind of felt. So in terms of that virtual environment, it was based on a early Victorian era map of New York City, but from when New York City was just being created. And again, the server application was sort of tapping into that collection item in real time. So the city would actually get, procedurally constructed every day from that source material map, and of course my set of instructions to create the city, but would be altered every day by how users were interacting with that collection item online on Flickr Commons. So for me it was, even though it was an aesthetically beautiful piece, I was told by a lot of people, and visitors really loved it. For me, the biggest beauty was sort of looking at the concept, just this notion of a virtual city that is created for one day, and that at the end of the day it's destroyed, and then another city will be rezzed, the next day. But in terms of how that is built, it was basically the interactions of users online. So, and also in the gallery there at the library, we had basically QR codes, so people could use the artwork as an interface to the collection item. But of course, through that process of interfacing the collection item through the artwork, that in itself would change the artwork for the next day. So this idea of new kinds of interactivity and sort of new possibilities for creation that, again, just 20 years ago just would not have been possible, because these things did not exist. And really for me, if I'm thinking about the world and, in archives, really this is what I was sort of reflected on during the show, and this was, the artist statement that I provided. But one part in particular, that I'll just read to you, when an archive becomes digital and it's open to the world, it becomes a living structure that is constantly changing as people connect to it, to use it, and they leave traces of themselves. For me, that's a real interesting thing, because that plays right to the heart of what is virtual. It's this notion of interaction and experience that is so important in the worlds and the things that we can actually create. Because just to my final slide, just to end on sort of a thought, if I'm actually trying to create things and work in this notion of the born virtual, then I want to look at things that are beyond simulation. And if I'm looking to pull in also beauties from the analog world and the histories we have here, things that are inherently physical, it's also like trying to, how do we make that, in the virtual, also non-deterministic? That is something that is not just a sequence of algorithms, that is not just a random number generator, that has a true kind of living aspect component to it, that we start to bring these worlds together. And hopefully that will be a good segue for Mark, as I know when he picks up, he'll be talking a lot about his self and his own use of the technology in a very different kind of way than I use. Anyway, thank you.